Welcome again to the Iconoclasts. I'm Yanis Varoufakis.
And I'm Wolfgang Munchau.
Today we're going to be discussing China and whether it actively pursues the replacement of the American dollar with its own currency. You read the financial press and you cannot escape the narrative that China is actively trying to de-dollarize the world. I read here on Yahoo Finance, could China's yuan replace the US dollar as the world's dominant currency? The International Business Time, China declares currency war. New plan aims to replace the dollar with the yuan in global trade. Market Watch, could China's yuan replace the dollar as a reserve currency? The Economist, the great economist, China is ditching the dollar fast. Foreign policy, a BRICS currency could shake the dollar's dominance. NPR, is the dollar's reign ending? When we say that the dollar is the reserve currency, it's not only that it is used by central banks around the world as reserves, but it is also the only currency that is in demand even by people who do not want to buy any goods and services from America. If you want to buy British pounds, it is because you want to spend them in Britain. It is because you want to visit Britain, to study in Britain, to be a tourist in Britain. But every time you put petrol in your car, even if you are in Italy and the company that you buy petrol from is French and the crude comes from Algeria, because oil is denominated in US dollars, there will be a small increase in the demand for American dollars. This is the reserve currency. This is the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. Now, I understand why the financial press all over the world is so keen to discuss the possibility of de-dollarisation because, let's face it, the United States economy is not what it used to be. It is not hegemonic anymore when it comes to industry. It has shrunk as a percentage of aggregate industrial production worldwide. I mean, they can't even build a fast train between Washington, D.C. and New York. What is it that maintains American hegemony, apart of course, from the American Army, Navy, and Air Force? It is the fact that they issue the currency in which the rest of the world does business. Here is my argument. China truly, really loathes the idea of replacing the American dollar with its own currency. Yes, undoubtedly, Beijing wants to break away from the power of Washington to sanction, to prevent payments of agents, of companies, of nation states that it doesn't like, that the Americans don't like. But no, folks, China has no interest in turning its currency into the world's reserve currency. As for the argument that in the context of BRICS Plus, China is effectively testing this new global currency that will replace the dollar, I think that people who believe that, either on the left or on the right, either those who are China-phobics or those who are from a left-wing perspective or a global south perspective pro-China, I think they're mistaking what China's intentions are.
No, I agree that certainly China doesn't want to do this because China doesn't want to emulate the American way of dominating the world with the currency. And journalists tend to sort of, superimpose the American method, the idea of a currency, of a country that is absorbing other countries' trade surpluses. This will not be the Chinese method. But I fully agree that China wants to break the dominance of the dollar in terms of America's ability to coerce other countries to follow its will, to impose secondary sanctions in particular. That's certainly a game, and you see this in BRICS Pay and some of the other systems that are being set up. But you're absolutely right. They're not trying to get their own currency to replace it. And we may actually enter a world where a single currency may no longer be dominant. I mean, the idea that a single currency dominates, it originates from, I think there were some thoughts dating back to the 1930s, in the work of economic historians like Charles Kindleberger, who came up with this idea that only one currency can ever dominate the world. And this was true because of the way the financial infrastructure worked for many decades until today. But this need not always be the case. You have crypto, you have blockchain technologies, you have completely different infrastructure possibilities today. It is not necessary that one currency has to dominate anybody.
Some time ago, I was talking to a high-ranking Chinese official, and I put it to him. And he said, Yanis, if you had $4.5 trillion dollars stashed away in a Swiss bank account, would you want either the Swiss banking system or the dollar to uh, to be torn up and burst asunder? And we need to follow the money. If you are a Chinese old-fashioned capitalist in Shanghai and you are producing aluminium, which you are exporting to California, the exorbitant privilege of the American dollar is the only reason why you have a customer. Because the United States, as we all know, is deeply in the red in terms of its trade accounts. Its capacity to issue the world's reserve currency is the reason why they can continue to buy from this particular Chinese gentleman. And of course, within the Chinese Communist Party, there are a lot of different interests, and some of them are clashing fiercely with one another. So you have Chinese big tech, you have Chinese pharmaceutical companies, you have Chinese workers represented through their trades union. But the lobby of the exporters, of the industry, of heavy industry of China, they hear any mention of the possibility that the United States dollar will be jeopardized or it will recede, and they actually panic.
But would they not need to consider the possibility that something might happen to the dollar? Would they not incur or need to engage in risk management? I would have thought it is a matter of prudence to simply diversify away from the US dollar into other currencies, rather than rely on an infrastructure that may, we may have a debt crisis, we may have an inflation crisis, we may have both, we may have a Bitcoin. We talked about it last week. We may have a stablecoin crisis. There are a lot of potentials for this gambit to go wrong.
Well, absolutely, and they're doing that. They are creating the infrastructure, if needs be, but they're not keenly working towards needing to use it and to use it in order to replace the American dollar. So the central bank digital currency of the People's Republic of China, the various private payment systems that are like, for instance, Tencent's WeChat, the remarkable, in my view, payment system that the BRICS have created, BRICS Pay, which is based on a functioning and all singing, all dancing blockchain. So it's a blockchain, it's not Bitcoin, it's not private money, it is a blockchain that allows transactions to take place within the BRICS countries in their own currency, but bypassing the Western system, clunky systems like SWIFT, for instance. Now, SWIFT is a very clunky, very archaic system by which we send money. Whenever you send money from one country to another, it goes through this messaging system. It's a bit like an email system between financial institutions, which takes a few days, actually, unless you pay much more to make it faster, to transfer funds from one jurisdiction to another. So they are creating the infrastructure, which, interestingly, this is my view, Wolfgang, I don't know whether you agree with that or what kind of information you have. It's actually used a little bit more than the Chinese would like. So it is as if they have created an alternative motorway system, autobahn system, just in case the clunky Western one starts developing serious problems. They don't want it to be used that much. But, now increasingly, especially after the war in Ukraine, it is used a little bit more than what the Beijing authorities would like.
One has to distinguish between business China does with the United States, that will always be, go through the dollar channels. Business China does with, say, Brazil or Russia or South Africa, that does not need, and at the moment it goes through the dollar channels. There is no need for that to go through the dollar channels. And there is certainly a diversification possibility that China says, okay, for business we're doing with others, we can avoid the dollar financial infrastructure and therefore use BRICS Pay. I agree with you. It's a very successful system. I think this has a long way to go. I don't think the Chinese are particularly clear about what they want. It's sort of, I think there is a process, as you said, there will be internal conflicts. I don't think President Xi has, as clear a strategy about the financial side as he does have about the industrial side. So I think this is sort of a work in progress type of thing. But I would agree with you that the goal is absolutely not to turn the renminbi into the leading global currency, because that would come with responsibilities that China doesn't want to take, and it comes with the liberalization of the capital markets, which China also doesn't want to have. So the downsides definitely outweigh the very dubious upsides here.
As you say, the Chinese do not want to lose control of their money supply. And if your currency becomes the reserve currency of the world, you lose, to a very large extent, you lose many degrees of freedom in determining your money supply. Interestingly, there seems to be a kind of coalescence, proximity in the views of somebody like Stephen Miran, Trump's economic and financial guru, and some of the things I hear coming from Beijing, in the sense that the Trumpian economic team has for a while now been portraying the reserve currency of the American dollar as a burden for the United States, not as something that needs to be preserved as the most important thing in the world. I mean, Trump wants to preserve it. But reading Stephen Miran and Scott Bessent and others within the Trump administration, you see that they talk about what we consider in Europe, for instance, the exorbitant privilege. This is Giscard d'Estaing calling out the American privilege to print as much money as they want in order to buy the net exports of the rest of the world. But they see that this exorbitant privilege is also an exorbitant burden, because it is as if the United States has to provide the central banks of the rest of the world with reserves. And that inflates the value of the dollar and expands or maintains the trade deficit of the United States. So there seems to be a common narrative here between the Trumpians and some of the people in Beijing. And maybe the recent rapprochement, the ceasefire in this new Cold War, well, that may have been one of the constituent parts that led them together.
No, absolutely. I mean, Trump obviously is not a monetary economist. I don't think anyone has ever accused him of that. And he wants to have his cake and eating it. I mean, that's clear. So we should discount. I mean, I always discount what Trump says. Always care about what he does. Much more interesting and much more important. And you're right, Stephen Miran. His famous Mar-a-Lago paper that he wrote in November that got published earlier this year gave us a good inkling of the thinking of the Trump administration, of the people who really matter in the Trump administration. That would be him and Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. And they clearly have different views about that, more nuanced views about the role of the dollar as the global reserve currencies. They see the problems and they see a lot of the issues that arose in American economics. The deindustrialization, which led to a division in the country, was very much related to the role of the dollar and the international sort of the Washington consensus, basically, that was behind the global the era of globalization. And they really took steps to move away from this. They don't want to weaken the dollar as a global currency. I don't think this is a specific goal, but they certainly want to redress this responsibility that came with it, and wouldn't mind if there was more sort of diversification globally. It is coming to an end. This is no longer a question of who's going to be the next president or so. This will end because the various players in the world are adopting different roles. China's adopting a different role. They will still export to the United States. There will still be they will still transact in dollar. Europe will reorient itself. Europe will become less reliant on exports to the United States, and therefore also less reliant on the dollar. So things will take their course.
I reserved the right and opportunity for some other podcast that we will do in the following weeks to come back to the question of why was the reserve currency of the dollar so important to the United States. It's got nothing to do with the consensus amongst my macroeconomists. I agree entirely with you, but that's for another podcast. What I want to do now is to bring this discussion to a close, is to try to debunk, maybe you will disagree with me on this, to debunk another aspect of this story about what China is trying to do. Now, you ask the question or pose the question of, what is the strategy? What is the aim of President Xi and the Beijing regime regarding regarding the monetary system internationally? Now, I'm not sure I have the answer, but I suspect, and this is the result of some conversations I've had with people in Beijing and in Shanghai, I suspect that as a plan B, if the new Cold War escalates further, if any of the things you mentioned, Wolfgang, crisis, stablecoin crisis, Wall Street crisis, some kind of derivatives crisis, if it hits them and they need to decouple in order to create a Chinese wall between the West and China when a tsunami of financial troubles hits, the plan which I am beginning to discern that they have is turning the BRICS plus region into a new form of a Bretton Woods system, except that it will be China, not in the United States, at its heart. By that, what I mean to do is also debunk the story that you cannot have capital controls and have the reserve currency. Well, that's not true, because the Bretton Woods system had capital controls, and the United States dollar was the linchpin. It was the foundation of it. But for that, you need to create something like the Bretton Woods system. So a system whereby, let's say, trade between China, India, Russia, South Africa, and all those 33 nations that now have joined loosely or less loosely BRICS Plus. Maybe a system whereby there are not fixed but controlled exchange rates with capital controls between them, and with a system whereby, essentially, that was the essence of Bretton Woods, the American surpluses were being recycled across the Bretton Woods era. That might be a way in which the Chinese may be considering how to maintain their surpluses while maintaining monetary dominance amongst the BRICS, if needs be, if the Americans push them too hard.
Yanis, if you were the Chinese finance ministers, I have no doubt that this is what would probably happen. My sense, I've also had a recent conversation with the senior monetary official. My sense is, they do understand the global situation very well. That was also my impression, but I do not have the sense that there is a plan. Now, Xi has great ideas for industry. He understands industry at a very detailed level. He's also had a great military strategy. But on finance, this is I would call this mostly undecided, unresolved, debating stage stuff. There have been committees for China to reduce their dependence on the dollars and to think about this eventuality that you mentioned. My information is that this is not yet a fully worked out strategy, and as you said yourself in your conversation with one of the Chinese officials, they have so much invested in dollars, they're not going to look forward to the idea of a dollar crash. They're prioritizing industry because that's where the chokehold happens. They want to be independent. Their independence is very much to do with energy, with the fact that they can supply, that their supplies are secure, that their exports can function. They are facing big economic decisions ahead. I mean, they're overinvested. We all know that. They're running huge surpluses. There's massive overcapacity. There's a ruinous competition between Chinese companies that President Xi himself has now complained about, that there is too much reckless competition, as he called it, between companies. So the question is, what kind of currency regime would we have is totally interesting. But the question will arise, I think, if, or rather when, there is a financial crisis. I'm sure that this discussion will accelerate massively, and a lot of the people who would oppose this would probably be quieter at that point, because then it becomes urgent. I think we'll probably have a Chinese move on Taiwan before we have a Chinese move on a BRICS currency.
Look, I'm very pleased to report that there is zero chance that the people of China are going to have to deal with me as their finance minister, which is wonderful news for both the people of China and for me. These discussions, however, as you intimated, I want to reinforce your point. The discussions that are taking place in China on these possibilities, and it includes what I was talking about as one potential route for them to follow, are far more sophisticated than anything I have listened to in Europe over the last 20, 30 years. And indeed, even in the United States, I have to say that. As a committed opponent of Donald Trump and his merry men and some of the women, only the Trumpians have interesting things to say about finance in the United States. I mean, the Democrats, the centrists, great economists whose name I'm not going to mention, when it comes to discussing the dollar, when it comes to discussing the relationship between capital flows and trade flows, I don't hear much which is of interest. It's only amongst the Chinese and the Trumpians. And that, for me, a leftist, is something to mourn about, but I have, in the interests of our UnHerd listeners, to come clean on that. Would you like to have the final word?
Yeah, I mean, as a liberal myself, I have to say that I also feel very uneasy about this. I have concluded some time ago that if you want to understand the global macroeconomy, global macroeconomics is not very helpful in achieving that goal. You better look at financial flows. You better look at other explanations of why something happened. Global macro predicted that the Trump tariffs would lead to an immediate rise in inflation, a collapse in global trade. It didn't happen. Virtually all the predictions turned wrong. And so I have concluded that the model is wrong. I also think the monetary models are wrong in a sense, not only that they make bad forecasts, but that they actually no longer grasp the essential nature of our economies, which are much more financially dominant. We have fiscal dominance, we have financial dominance, we have innovation of an unprecedented scale. This was not a factor in macroeconomic models until very recently, and certainly not in mainstream models. So there's stuff going on at the moment that is sort of outside the framework of a classic macroeconomist, and I think we need to kind of reassess the importance of the different issues and kind of think again. But that's not a strength of macroeconomists.
Well, that's why we're Econoclasts. As a professor for many, many years, I was aghast that we teach students macroeconomics and international trade on the basis of the so-called ISLM model, which assumes, takes it for granted, doesn't prove it. It takes it as a given, that investment always equals savings, which is something we should have proved. And something we should really worry about, because investment often is much lower than savings, and in some cases, it's greater than savings. So the moment you have models which presume that which they should be proving, and the consensus is built on these models which are by definition axiomatically wrong, then of course you end up with a situation where, in order to make sense of the world we live in, we have to debunk what passes as the top-notch, top-shelf economic theory. I think that we've covered that enough. I think we've agreed that China does not want to replace the dollar, but it is doing its best in order to maintain its independence from primarily Washington, D.C.'s sanctions. Don't forget to rate, like, and subscribe to the Econoclasts from wherever you get your podcast.
I'm Wolfgang Munchau.
And I'm Yanis Varoufakis. Thank you for listening.